The auctioneer's voice rang hollow in the Montana wind. "Last one, gentlemen. Mara Ellison. No dowry, no family, scarred face, 26 years old." Jonah Reed watched her stand there, chin up, eyes empty of hope, while men turned away like she was spoiled meat. Something about her stillness cut through him. "I'll take her." The crowd went silent. Mara's head snapped toward him, shock splitting her careful mask. He didn't know why he'd spoken, didn't know what he'd just done. But the words were out, and in the territories, a man's word was law. If you want to see how a choice neither of them understood becomes the thing that saves them both, stay with me to the end. And drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The town of Ember Hollow wasn't much. A trading post, a blacksmith, a saloon that doubled as a church on Sundays, and a stretch of mud they generously called Main Street. It squatted in the shadow of the Rockies like something the mountains had coughed up and forgotten. Jonah Reed rode in just after dawn, his horse tired, his saddlebags nearly empty, and his mind on nothing but coffee, nails, and getting back to his cabin before dark. He didn't plan on staying long. He never did. Jonah was a man built for silence. 32 years old, lean and weathered, with hands that knew more about splitting wood than shaking in greeting. His face had the kind of hardness that came from years alone, sharp jaw, deep-set eyes the color of storm clouds, a mouth that didn't waste itself on small talk. People in Ember Hollow knew him by sight, not by name. He bought what he needed, paid in coin or pelts, and left without lingering. That morning should have been no different. But when he tied his horse outside the trading post, he heard the noise, a crowd gathering near the center of town, voices rising in that peculiar mix of excitement and judgment that only came when people had something to pick apart. Jonah's instinct was to ignore it. Crowds meant trouble, or gossip, or both. But the trading post was closed, a hand-scrawled sign on the door reading, "Back in an hour. Bride, call." Jonah swore under his breath. Bride calls. He'd heard of them, seen one or two in his years drifting through territorial towns. When settlements were too remote and women too scarce, arrangements were made. Women came west on promises, sometimes from agencies back east, sometimes from families looking to offload unmarried daughters, sometimes fleeing things they wouldn't name. Men gathered, chose, and contracts were signed. It wasn't romantic, it was practical. Brutal, even. But out here, survival didn't leave room for romance. Still, Jonah had never paid it much mind. He didn't need a wife, didn't want one. His cabin was small, his life smaller, and he preferred it that way. Marriage meant expectations, compromise, and the kind of closeness that made a man vulnerable. He'd learned long ago that the only person you could rely on was yourself. But the trading post was closed, and he had time to kill. He walked toward the crowd, more out of boredom than curiosity, and positioned himself at the back, arms crossed, hat pulled low. From there, he could see the makeshift platform, a few planks of wood laid across barrels, and the man standing on it. Clarence Hooper, the town's self-appointed coordinator, a weasel of a man with a voice like gravel and a smile that never reached his eyes. "Gentlemen, gentlemen," Hooper called, raising his hands. "We've got a fine selection today, 12 women, all willing, all able. Good stock, I assure you." Jonah's jaw tightened. Good stock. Like they were cattle. The women stood in a line off to the side, dressed in their best, or what passed for best out here. Some looked hopeful, eyes bright and hands clasped. Others looked resigned, shoulders slumped, faces blank. A few were young, barely out of girlhood. A couple were older, worn by years Jonah could only guess at. One by one, Hooper called them forward. "This here's Lily Brennan, 19, good cook, comes with a dowry of $20 and a set of linens." A broad-shouldered man near the front stepped forward immediately. "I'll take her." Hooper grinned. "Sold to Garrett Mills. Congratulations, Lily." The girl, Lily, smiled nervously and stepped down, and the man led her away without another word. The transaction took less than a minute, and so it went. Woman after woman called forward, claimed, led away. Some men asked questions. Can you sew? Can you handle livestock? Any children? But most didn't bother. They looked, decided, and moved on. Jonah watched with a growing sense of disgust, but he didn't leave. Something kept him there. rooted at the edge of the crowd, even as the line of women dwindled. Finally, only one remained. Hooper hesitated, glancing at his list, then at the woman, then back at the crowd. His smile faltered. "All right then, last one." He cleared his throat. "Mara Ellison, 26, no dowry, no family." The woman stepped forward. Jonah saw her fully for the first time. She wasn't beautiful, not in the way men usually measured. Her face was angular, her skin sun-darkened and weathered. A scar ran from her left temple down to her jaw, pale and puckered, the kind of mark left by something violent. Her hair was dark, pulled back severely, and her dress was plain, patched in places, too big in others. She stood with her hands folded, her expression carefully neutral, but Jonah saw the way her fingers trembled slightly. "She's older than most," Hooper continued, his tone apologetic now, like he was trying to sell a horse with a limp. "But she can work. Strong back, knows her way around a homestead." Silence. The men shifted uncomfortably. A few muttered to each other. One laughed, low and mean. "Any takers?" Hooper asked, his voice thinner now. More silence. Mara's jaw tightened, but she didn't look away. She kept her eyes forward, fixed on some point beyond the crowd, and Jonah realized with a sharp, cold clarity that she'd been through this before. She knew how it would end. "Come on now," Hooper pressed, desperation creeping in. "She's not much to look at, I'll grant you, but she's healthy, capable, and she won't cost you a dime." A man near the front spat into the dirt. "I'd need to be paid to take that one." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Mara flinched, just barely, just enough that Jonah saw it. And something in him snapped. He didn't think, didn't plan. He just opened his mouth and let the words come. "I'll take her." The laughter died. Every head turned toward him. Hooper blinked, confused, as if he'd misheard. "You'll... what?" "I'll take her," Jonah repeated, louder this time, his voice flat and final. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Men stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Hooper looked between Jonah and Mara, mouth working soundlessly. And Mara was staring at him with an expression he couldn't name. Shock, yes. Disbelief. But beneath it, something raw and unguarded, something she quickly buried as she straightened her shoulders. Hooper recovered first, his smile snapping back into place. "Well, excellent. Jonah Reed, isn't it? Didn't know you were in the market for a wife." "I wasn't," Jonah said simply, "but I said I'll take her. Let's finish this." Hooper hesitated, then nodded quickly, sensing that pushing the matter would only lose him the sale. Of course. Miss Ellison, you're to go with Mr. Reed. Contract will be drawn up by this evening, just a formality, you understand. Congratulations to you both." The crowd was already dispersing, disappointed there wouldn't be more spectacle. Jonah ignored them. He stepped through the thinning mass of bodies and stopped a few feet from Mara, unsure what to say, unsure what he'd just committed himself to. She looked up at him. She was tall, but he was taller, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, she said, "Why?" Her voice was low, rough, like it didn't get used much. Jonah didn't have an answer, at least not one that made sense, so he told her the only truth he could. "I don't know." She studied him, her dark eyes searching his face for something, mockery, pity, cruelty. When she didn't find it, her expression softened, just a fraction. "I'm not what you think," she said quietly. "I don't think anything," Jonah replied. "I don't know you." "Exactly." Her mouth twisted, bitter. "You don't know me, so why would you choose me?" "Because no one else did." The words came out harsher than he meant, but they were honest. And honesty was all he had. Mara's breath hitched, and for a second he thought she might cry. But she didn't. She just nodded, once sharp and small. "All right then." "All right? I'll come with you." She glanced past him toward the mountains rising in the distance. "Anything's better than this." Jonah wanted to tell her not to be so sure. His cabin was isolated, his life was hard, and he had no idea how to live with another person, let alone a wife. But he didn't say any of that. Instead, he just gestured toward his horse. "I'll get supplies. We leave in an hour." She nodded again and turned away, heading toward a small building at the edge of town. probably where the women had been staying. Jonah watched her go, her back straight despite everything, and felt a strange weight settle in his chest. What the hell had he just done? An hour later, they were riding north. Jonah had bought what he needed: nails, coffee, flour, a few other essentials, and packed it all onto his horse. Mara appeared with a single canvas bag slung over her shoulder, everything she owned in the world, apparently. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. No one came to see her off. Jonah offered her his horse, but she shook her head. "I can walk. It's 15 miles. I've walked farther." He didn't argue. Instead, he fell into step beside her, leading the horse by the reins, and they headed into the wilderness together, two strangers bound by a decision neither fully understood. For the first few miles, they didn't speak. The land stretched out around them, vast and unforgiving, the sky a hard, endless blue. Jonah was used to silence. It was his natural state. But Mara's silence felt different, heavier, like it carried weight. Finally, he broke it. "You don't have to be afraid of me." She glanced at him, surprised. "I'm not. Most people are." "Why?" "Because I don't talk much. And I don't smile." He paused. "And I live alone in the middle of nowhere." Mara considered that, then shrugged. "I don't talk much either. And I don't smile. And I've been alone most of my life." She looked at him sidelong. "So I guess we're even." Jonah almost smiled at that. Almost. They kept walking. "Where are you from?" he asked after a while. "Pennsylvania, originally." Her voice was careful, like she was deciding how much to give him. "My parents died when I was young. Fever. I was passed around to relatives until I wasn't useful anymore. Then I came west." "Looking for what?" "Nothing." She said it flatly. "Just away." Jonah understood that. Away was a destination he knew well. "What about you?" Mara asked, turning the question back on him. "Born in Missouri. Parents had a farm. It failed. My father drank himself to death. My mother followed a year later." He kept his tone even, factual. "I've been on my own since I was 17. 15 years, Mara said quietly, give or take. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's a long time to be alone. It's safer." "Safer than what?" "Than caring about people." Mara looked at him, something shifting in her expression. "You're right," she said. "It is." They didn't speak again until they reached a small creek where Jonah called a halt to let the horse drink. Mara knelt by the water, cupping her hands and drinking deeply, and Jonah watched her, struck again by how self-sufficient she seemed. She didn't ask for help, didn't wait for permission. She just did what needed to be done. Maybe that was why he'd chosen her. Or maybe he was just a fool. "Your face," he said suddenly, then winced. "Idiot." "The scar. You don't have to tell me. I just—" "House fire," Mara said, cutting him off. She didn't look at him, just kept staring at the water. "I was 12. My uncle's house. I tried to get my cousin out, but the beam fell before I could. She didn't make it. I did." Her hand drifted to her cheek, tracing the line of the scar. "Everyone said I should have died instead." Jonah's chest tightened. "That's not true." "Isn't it?" She finally looked at him, and her eyes were hard. "She was 7, beautiful. Everyone loved her. I was just there. And after, I was a reminder. So they sent me away." Jonah didn't know what to say to that. Words felt useless, so he did the only thing he could. He met her gaze and held it, steady and unflinching, until she looked away first. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's keep moving." They reached his cabin just before dusk. It wasn't much, a single-room structure built from rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney rising from one side. The roof was solid, at least, and the door still hung straight. A small corral stood nearby, empty except for a lean-to for the horse. Beyond that, a patch of land that might have been a garden once, now overgrown with weeds. Jonah stopped a few yards from the door, suddenly aware of how shabby it all looked through someone else's eyes. "It's not much," he said. Mara walked past him, dropped her bag by the door, and turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. Then she looked at him. "It's more than I had this morning." Something eased in Jonah's chest. All right then, he said. Let's get you inside. That night they ate in near silence, dried venison, hardtack, and water. Jonah gave Mara the only bed, a narrow frame in the corner with a thin mattress, and made a pallet for himself by the fire. She protested, but he waved her off. I'm used to it. She didn't argue further. As the fire burned low, Jonah lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of her breathing on the other side of the room. He still didn't know why he'd chosen her, didn't know what he'd expected. But as he drifted toward sleep, one thought lingered, clear and undeniable. He wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in 15 years, he wasn't sure how he felt about that. Morning came cold and gray, the kind of dawn that made the mountains look like iron. Jonah woke to find Mara already up, kneeling by the hearth, coaxing the embers back to life. She moved quietly, efficiently, like someone who'd learned early not to take up too much space in the world. He sat up, rubbing his face, and she glanced over her shoulder. Coffee? She asked. Yeah, thanks. She didn't respond, just set the pot on the hook over the fire and waited. Jonah pulled on his boots and stepped outside, the cold air hitting him like a fist. The sky was heavy with clouds, and the wind carried the smell of snow. Winter was coming early this year. He could feel it in his bones. When he came back inside, Mara had set out 2 tin cups, steam rising from both. She handed him one without ceremony, and he took it, their fingers brushing for just a second. She pulled back quickly, like she'd touched something hot. They drank in silence. After a while, Jonas said, I'll be working on the corral today. Fence needs mending before the weather turns. Mara nodded. What do you want me to do? He hesitated. The truth was, he didn't know. He'd never had anyone else to account for. His days were his own, shaped by necessity and routine. Adding another person into that, it felt like trying to fit a new piece into a puzzle that was already complete. But she was here now, and she was watching him, waiting. There's a root cellar out back, he said finally. It's a mess, needs organizing. And the garden, if you can salvage anything from it, that'd help. All right. She set down her cup, tied her hair back with a strip of cloth, and headed for the door. Just like that. No questions, no complaints. Jonah watched her go, feeling something close to respect. The day unfolded in separate rhythms. Jonah worked the corral, replacing rotted posts and restringing wire, while Mara moved between the root cellar and the garden, hauling out broken crates, sweeping dirt, pulling weeds. They didn't speak much, but every so often, Jonah would glance up and see her, bent over a stubborn root, or carrying an armload of salvaged vegetables, her face set with quiet determination. She worked like someone who'd been told her whole life that her worth was measured in usefulness, and maybe it had been. Maybe that was the only language she knew. By midday, the wind had picked up and the first flakes of snow began to fall. Jonah called a halt and went inside to check on the fire. Mara followed a few minutes later, her hands red and raw from the cold. Here, Jonah said, pulling a tin of salve from a shelf. For your hands. She stared at it like it was a foreign object. I'm fine. You're bleeding. She looked down at her knuckles, where the skin had split, and shrugged. It's nothing. Take it anyway. For a moment he thought she'd refuse, but then she reached out and took the tin, her fingers careful, like she was afraid of breaking it. Thank you, she said quietly. He nodded and turned away, busying himself with stirring the pot of stew he'd set over the fire earlier. Behind him, he heard the soft sound of the tin opening, the faint rustle of her rubbing the salve into her skin. When he glanced back, she was staring at her hands like they belonged to someone else. They ate in silence again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not uncomfortable exactly, just new, unfamiliar. Jonah didn't know what to do with it, so he did what he always did. He focused on the practical. Snow's coming, he said. We'll need more firewood, and I want to check the roof before it gets bad. Mara nodded. I'll help. You don't have to. I said I'll help. Her tone was firm, and Jonah recognized something in it, a refusal to be coddled, to be treated like she couldn't handle herself. He understood that. He'd spent most of his life proving the same thing. All right, he said. Tomorrow then. That night, as they settled into their separate spaces, her in the bed, him by the fire, Mara spoke into the darkness. Why do you live out here? Jonah didn't answer right away. The fire crackled and the wind howled outside, and he thought about how to put 15 years of solitude into words. Because it's quiet, he said finally, and because no one expects anything from me. Is that what you want, to be left alone? It's what I'm used to. That's not the same thing. Jonah turned his head, looking toward the corner where she lay. He couldn't see her face in the dark, but he could hear the weight in her voice. What about you? He asked. What do you want? Mara was quiet for a long time, so long that Jonah thought she might not answer. But then she said softly, I don't know. I've spent so long just trying to survive. I never thought about wanting. Jonah closed his eyes. He knew that feeling too well. Maybe that's something we can figure out, he said. Maybe. And then there was only the sound of the fire and the wind and two people learning to exist in the same space. The days began to blur together, measured not in hours, but in tasks. Jonah and Mara moved around each other like dancers learning a new routine, awkward at first, stepping on each other's toes, but gradually finding a rhythm. He chopped wood, and she stacked it. He hunted, and she dressed the game. He repaired the roof, and she patched the gaps in the walls with fresh mud and moss. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. There was a language in the work itself, in the way she handed him tools before he asked, in the way he left water heating over the fire when she came in, cold and exhausted. Small gestures, unspoken understandings. One afternoon, about a week after they'd arrived, Jonah came back from checking his traps to find the cabin transformed. The floor had been swept clean, the shelves reorganized, the clutter that had accumulated over years of solitary living cleared away. Mara stood by the hearth, stirring something that smelled better than anything Jonah had cooked in months. What is this? He asked, looking around. I found some dried herbs in the cellar, she said without looking up. And there were carrots and onions still good in the garden. Figured I'd make something other than stew. Jonah set down his catch, 2 rabbits, and crossed to the pot, peering in. It looked like soup, thick and rich, steam rising in fragrant curls. Smells good, he said. It's just soup. Still. Mara glanced at him then, and something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, or pleasure. It was gone too quickly for Jonah to be sure. They ate together that night, and Jonah found himself watching her across the table. The harsh lines of her face had softened slightly in the firelight, and he realized that she wasn't plain at all. She was striking in a way that had nothing to do with conventional beauty. There was strength in the set of her jaw, intelligence in her eyes, and a quiet dignity in the way she held herself. You're staring, she said, not looking up from her bowl. Sorry. Why are you sorry? I don't know. Seemed like the thing to say. Mara's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. You're strange, Jonah Reed. So I've been told. I don't mean it as an insult. I know. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Jonah felt something shift between them. A crack in the wall they'd both been maintaining. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. Do you regret it, choosing me? Jonah set down his spoon, considering the question. The honest answer was complicated. Did he regret it? Some days when the silence felt too heavy and he didn't know what to say to her maybe. But other days, most days if he was being truthful, no. No, he said. I don't. Why not? Because you work hard. You don't complain, and you make better soup than I do. Mara laughed. A short, startled sound, like it had escaped before she could stop it. Jonah realized it was the first time he'd heard her laugh, and the sound did something strange to his chest. That's a low bar, she said. Still counts. She shook her head, but she was smiling now, small and hesitant. You're not what I expected either. What did you expect? I don't know. Someone cruel, maybe? Or someone who'd ignore me completely. But you're neither of those things. I'm just trying to figure this out, Jonah said. Same as you. Yeah. Mara looked down at her hands, turning them over like she was seeing them for the first time. Yeah, I guess we are. Winter came in earnest 2 weeks later, swift and brutal. The snow fell in thick, heavy curtains, piling up against the cabin walls and weighing down the trees. Jonah and Mara settled into a new routine, dictated by survival. Every morning, Jonah would dig a path to the corral and the woodpile. Mara would keep the fire going, melt snow for water, and prepare whatever food they had. In the afternoons, they'd work on indoor tasks, mending clothes, repairing tools, reinforcing the cabin's defenses against the cold. The isolation pressed in, but in a way, it also freed them. There were no expectations here, no eyes watching and judging. Just the two of them and the work. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, Mara sat by the fire, sewing a patch onto one of Jonah's shirts. He was whittling a new handle for a broken axe, the rhythmic scrape of the knife against wood the only sound besides the howling wind. "Tell me about the farm," Mara said suddenly. "Your parents' farm." Jonah paused, surprised. They'd shared facts about their pasts, but never stories, never details. "It was small," he said after a moment. "Barely enough to feed us, let alone make a profit. My father worked himself to the bone trying to make it succeed, but the land was poor and the weather was worse. After a few bad harvests, he just gave up." "And your mother?" "She tried to hold things together, but when he started drinking, it broke something in her. She lasted a year after he died, but I think she'd already decided she didn't want to be here anymore." Mara's hand stilled on the fabric. "That must have been hard, being alone so young." "It was necessary," Jonah said. "I learned fast that the only person I could count on was myself." "Is that why you came out here, to make sure you'd never have to count on anyone again?" Jonah looked at her, struck by how well she understood. "Yeah, I guess it is." Mara nodded slowly. "I understand that. After my cousin died, I was shuffled around so much. Different relatives, different towns, always temporary, always conditional. I'd start to settle in, and then something would happen. I'd break something, or eat too much, or just exist too loudly. And they'd send me away again." She set down the shirt, her hands folding in her lap. "After a while, I stopped trying. It was easier not to care." "But you came west anyway," Jonah said. "That took courage." "Or desperation." Mara's smile was bitter. "I think I was just tired of being a burden. Out here, at least, if I fail, it's on my own terms." "You're not failing." "How do you know?" "Because you're still here, and you're working, and you haven't given up." Jonah set down the axe handle and met her eyes. "That's more than most people can say." Mara looked away, but not before Jonah saw the sheen of tears in her eyes. She blinked them back quickly, her jaw tight, and picked up the shirt again. "Thank you," she whispered. Jonah didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and went back to his whittling. But the words stayed with him, echoing in the quiet space between them. As the weeks passed, something began to change. The wariness that had defined their early days together started to soften, replaced by something tentative and fragile. Trust, maybe. Or at least the beginning of it. Mara started to talk more, sharing small pieces of herself. Stories about the places she'd lived, the people she'd known, the things she'd dreamed about before she learned not to dream. Jonah found himself listening, really listening, and sometimes even sharing his own stories in return. One night she asked him if he'd ever wanted a family. Jonah stared into the fire, the question settling over him like snow. "Once," he said finally, "when I was younger. But after my parents died, I couldn't see the point. Family just meant more people to lose." "And now?" "Now? I don't know." He glanced at her, sitting cross-legged on the floor, her face half lit by the flames. "What about you?" Mara was quiet for a long time. "I used to," she said. "When I was a girl, I'd imagine having a house full of people who wanted me there. Not because I was useful, but just because I was me." She smiled, sad and distant. "But that was a long time ago." "Maybe it doesn't have to be." Mara looked at him, something raw and uncertain in her eyes. "What are you saying?" Jonah didn't know. He hadn't thought that far ahead. But sitting there in the warmth of the fire, with this woman who'd been unwanted her whole life, he realized something. He didn't want her to feel that way anymore. "I'm saying maybe we can build something here," he said carefully. "Not just a cabin, something more." "Like what?" "Like a life." Mara's breath caught, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then she nodded, slow and deliberate. "All right," she said. "Let's try." The snow finally began to ease in late December, though the cold lingered. Jonah and Mara had fallen into a comfortable rhythm by then, their days filled with work and their evenings with conversation. It wasn't love. Not yet, anyway. But it was something. A foundation, maybe. A possibility. One morning, Jonah woke to find Mara standing by the window, staring out at the frost-covered landscape. She looked smaller somehow, her shoulders hunched, her arms wrapped around herself. "You all right?" he asked. She didn't turn around. "Do you ever feel like you're waiting for something to go wrong?" Jonah stood and crossed to her, stopping a few feet away. "All the time. How do you deal with it?" "I don't." He shrugged. "I just keep going. One day at a time." Mara finally looked at him, and he saw the fear in her eyes. Not of him, but of hope. Of daring to believe that this fragile thing they were building might actually last. "What if I ruin this?" she whispered. "You won't." "You don't know that." "No," Jonah admitted, "but I'm willing to risk it if you are." Mara stared at him, and then, slowly, she nodded. "Okay. Okay." They stood there together, looking out at the frozen world, and Jonah felt something settle in his chest. Not certainty exactly, but something close. They were both still learning, still figuring out how to be two people instead of two solitary survivors. But they were trying, and for now, that was enough. Christmas came and went without ceremony. They had no decorations, no gifts, nothing to mark the day except a slightly larger meal and the quiet acknowledgement that they'd made it this far. As they sat by the fire that night, Mara said, "I've never had a Christmas like this." "Like what?" "Peaceful." Jonah thought about all the Christmases he'd spent alone, the years blurring together into a monotonous stretch of cold and silence. This was different. Better, maybe. "Me neither," he said. Mara smiled then, a real smile, full and genuine, and Jonah felt something crack open inside him. He'd spent so long keeping people at arm's length, convinced that closeness meant pain. But maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe closeness just meant risk, and maybe risk was worth it. As January arrived, the worst of the winter behind them, Jonah began to notice small changes. Mara laughed more easily now, her smiles coming quicker. She moved through the cabin with a sense of ownership, rearranging things, adding small touches that made it feel less like a shelter and more like a home. She'd found an old quilt in the cellar and mended it, draping it over the bed. She'd carved a simple hook for hanging coats by the door. She'd even started a small collection of pine cones on the mantel, arranged with surprising artistry. And Jonah, well, he'd started to relax. The tension he carried, the constant vigilance, began to ease. He found himself looking forward to the evenings, to the conversations by the fire, to the sound of her voice filling the spaces he'd once kept empty. One night, as they sat together, Mara said, "I think this is the first place I've ever felt like I belonged." Jonah looked at her, and the words came before he could stop them. "You do belong here." Mara's eyes widened, and then she smiled, soft and hesitant and beautiful. "So do you," she said. And in that moment, Jonah realized that somewhere along the way, without planning it, without even meaning to, he'd stopped being alone. They'd become something else, something he didn't have a name for yet, but whatever it was, it felt like home. The knock came on a Tuesday afternoon in late February, so faint that at first Jonah thought he'd imagined it. He was outside splitting wood, and Mara was inside preparing their midday meal. The sky was the color of pewter, heavy with the promise of more snow, and the air had that peculiar stillness that came before a storm. The knock came again, stronger this time, and Jonah set down the axe and wiped his hands on his pants. They never had visitors. The cabin was too remote, the trails too treacherous in winter. Anyone who knew about this place knew better than to come calling without good reason. He rounded the corner of the cabin and stopped dead. A girl stood on his doorstep, maybe 12 or 13 years old, thin as a rail, her face pale and pinched with cold. She wore a coat that was too big and boots that were falling apart, and in her arms she held a bundle wrapped in what looked like an old blanket. Behind her, barely visible in the shadow of the trees, stood a boy, older, maybe 15 or 16, his hand on the girl's shoulder, his eyes wide and watchful. "Please," the girl said, her voice cracking. "Please, we need help." Jonah's first instinct was to say no, to send them away. He'd built this life specifically to avoid complications, and 2 desperate children on his doorstep was a complication of the highest order. But before he could speak, Mara appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of voices. She took one look at the girl and the bundle in her arms and said, "Get them inside. Now." Jonah didn't argue. Something in Mara's tone left no room for debate. He stepped aside and the girl stumbled forward, the boy following close behind. Mara ushered them both toward the fire, speaking in low, soothing tones, and Jonah closed the door against the cold. "Sit," Mara said, guiding the girl to a chair. "What's your name?" "Emma," the girl whispered. "And this is my brother Daniel." The boy, Daniel, nodded but didn't speak. His eyes darted around the cabin like he was mapping escape routes. "All right, Emma," Mara said gently. "What's in the blanket?" Emma's arms tightened around the bundle, and for the first time Jonah heard it, a faint, mewling cry, like a kitten. Except it wasn't a kitten. "My baby sister," Emma said, her voice breaking. "Her name is Grace. She's 6 months old." Mara knelt in front of the girl, her expression shifting from concern to something sharper. "Let me see her." Emma hesitated, then slowly peeled back the blanket. The infant inside was tiny, her face flushed and damp with sweat, her breathing shallow and labored. Even from across the room, Jonah could see that the child was sick. Mara's jaw tightened. How long has she been like this? 3 days, Emma said, tears streaming down her face now. Maybe 4, I don't know. I tried to keep her warm, but you did well, Mara interrupted, her voice firm. You got her here. That's what matters. She looked up at Jonah, and her eyes were blazing. I need clean water, boiling, and every blanket we have. Jonah moved without thinking, his body responding to the command in her voice. He filled the kettle and set it over the fire, then grabbed the blankets from the bed and the trunk in the corner. Behind him, Mara was already working, unwrapping the baby with careful hands, checking her over with the kind of precision that spoke of experience. Where are your parents? Mara asked, not looking up. Emma's face crumpled. Dead, both of them. Mama died when Grace was born, and Papa, he got sick last month. The fever took him. And you've been alone since then? We tried to make it to town, Daniel said, speaking for the first time. His voice was hoarse, exhausted. But the snow got bad, and Grace got worse, and we saw smoke from your chimney. We didn't know what else to do. Mara didn't respond right away. She was too focused on the baby, unwrapping her completely now, exposing the small, fragile body. The child's skin was hot to the touch, and her breathing rattled in her chest. Pneumonia, Mara said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Or close to it. Can you help her? Emma asked, her voice barely audible. Mara looked at the girl, and Jonah saw something in her face he'd never seen before. A fierce, protective determination. I'm going to try, Mara said, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that? Emma nodded, wiping her eyes. Good. Mara turned to Jonah. I need you to ride to town. We need medicine. Willow bark if they have it, and honey, and anything else the doctor recommends for a baby with lung trouble. Jonah stared at her. It's 15 miles. In this weather, I know what I'm asking. Mara's voice was steady, unyielding. But this baby won't make it through the night without help. You know that as well as I do. Jonah looked at the infant, at her tiny chest rising and falling with labored effort, and felt something twist in his gut. He did know, and he also knew that riding out now, with a storm coming, was dangerous, possibly deadly. But Mara was right. The baby wouldn't survive without intervention. All right, he said. I'll go. Mara's shoulders sagged with relief. Thank you. Jonah grabbed his coat and hat, then paused at the door. Keep them warm, and keep that fire going. I will. He met her eyes, and for a moment, the weight of what they were attempting pressed down on both of them. Then Jonah nodded and stepped out into the cold. The ride to town was brutal. The wind cut through his coat like a knife, and the snow came down in thick, blinding sheets. Jonah pushed his horse as hard as he dared, but the trail was treacherous, and twice they nearly stumbled. By the time he reached Ember Hollow, his hands were numb, and his face felt like frozen leather. He went straight to the doctor's house and pounded on the door. An older man answered, bleary-eyed and annoyed, but his expression changed when Jonah explained the situation. "Pneumonia in an infant?" the doctor said, shaking his head. "That's bad. Real bad. Can you give me something? Anything?" The doctor disappeared into his office and returned with a small bottle in a jar. "Willow bark tincture. And this is honey mixed with elderberry. Give her small doses, just a few drops at a time. Keep her warm and hydrated, and pray." Jonah took the supplies, paid the man, and rode back into the storm. The return trip was worse than the first, the cold seeping into his bones, exhaustion making his vision blur. But he kept going, driven by the image of Mara kneeling by that sick baby, by the desperate hope in Emma's eyes. He made it back just before midnight. Mara was still awake, sitting by the fire with the baby cradled against her chest. Emma and Daniel were asleep in the corner, huddled together under a pile of blankets. Mara looked up when Jonah entered, and the relief on her face was almost painful to see. "You made it," she breathed. "Barely." He handed her the bottle and the jar, his fingers so cold he could barely feel them. "Doctor said small doses. Keep her warm and hydrated." Mara nodded and immediately set to work, measuring out a tiny amount of the tincture and coaxing it into the baby's mouth. Grace sputtered and cried, but she swallowed, and Mara whispered soft, soothing words until the infant settled. Jonah collapsed into a chair, his body shaking with cold and fatigue. Mara glanced at him, then at the baby, clearly torn. "I'm fine," Jonah said before she could ask. "Take care of her." Mara hesitated, then nodded. "Get out of those wet clothes. There's stew in the pot." Jonah did as he was told, stripping down to dry layers and forcing himself to eat, even though his stomach felt like a clenched fist. Across the room, Mara continued to work, her hands steady, her focus absolute. She was different now, sharper, more alive, like she'd been waiting her whole life for a moment where she could prove she was more than the sum of other people's judgments. And she was proving it. Every second, with every careful movement, she was fighting for that baby's life. Jonah watched her, something shifting in his chest. He'd chosen her because no one else had. But now, seeing her like this, he realized he would have chosen her anyway, not out of pity or obligation, but because she was extraordinary. And he'd been too blind to see it until now. The night stretched on, measured in the baby's labored breaths, and Mara's whispered reassurances. Jonah dozed fitfully in his chair, jerking awake every time Grace cried or Mara moved. At some point, Daniel woke and came to stand beside Mara, his young face etched with fear. "She going to die?" he asked quietly. Mara looked up at him, and her expression was kind but honest. "I don't know, but I'm doing everything I can." "Why?" Daniel's voice cracked. "You don't even know us." "Because someone should have done the same for me once," Mara said simply, "and they didn't, so I'm doing it now." Daniel stared at her, and then, slowly, he nodded. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Just go back to sleep. You need your strength." The boy obeyed, returning to his sister's side, and Mara went back to her vigil. Jonah watched her for a long moment, then stood and crossed to her. "Let me take her for a while," he said. "You need rest." "I'm all right." "Mara." He crouched beside her, meeting her eyes. "You've been holding her for hours. Let me help." She looked like she wanted to argue, but exhaustion won. She carefully transferred the baby into Jonah's arms, showing him how to support her head, how to keep her upright so she could breathe easier. Grace was so small, so light, it was terrifying. Jonah had held plenty of things in his life, tools, weapons, reins, but never something this fragile. "Talk to her," Mara said, settling onto the floor beside him. "Babies respond to voices." "What do I say?" "Anything. Just let her know she's not alone." Jonah looked down at the baby's flushed face and felt utterly helpless. But Mara was watching him with those steady, expectant eyes, so he cleared his throat and began to speak. "All right, Grace," he said quietly. "I don't know if you can hear me, but if you can, I want you to know something. You've got people fighting for you. Your sister and your brother, they walked through a blizzard to get you here. And Mara, she's not going to let you go without a fight. So you need to fight too. You hear me? You need to hold on." The baby made a small sound, and Jonah's heart clenched. He kept talking, his voice low and steady, telling her about the mountains, about the way the sun looked when it broke over the peaks in the morning, about the deer that sometimes came to drink from the creek. He didn't know if any of it mattered, but Mara was right. It felt important to fill the silence. Beside him, Mara leaned her head against his shoulder, and Jonah felt the weight of her trust, her exhaustion, her hope. He shifted slightly, making room for her, and they sat like that, two people and a dying baby, holding on through the longest night of their lives. Dawn came gray and cold, and with it, a change. Grace's breathing, which had been shallow and labored all night, began to even out. Her fever broke sometime around sunrise, sweat soaking through the blankets, and when Mara checked her temperature, she let out a shaky breath. "It's dropping," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "She's fighting it." Jonah closed his eyes, relief crashing over him like a wave. "She's going to make it?" "I think so. But we need to keep watching her. Fevers can come back." Emma woke then, her eyes going immediately to the baby. "Is she—" "She's better," Mara said, smiling for the first time in hours. "She's going to be all right." Emma burst into tears, and Daniel pulled her into a fierce hug. Jonah stood, his legs stiff from sitting all night, and handed the baby back to Mara. She took Grace gently, cradling her close, and Jonah saw tears on her cheeks too. "You did it," he said quietly. "We did it," Mara corrected. "I couldn't have managed without you." Jonah didn't know how to respond to that, so he just nodded and turned away, busying himself with stoking the fire and preparing breakfast. Behind him he could hear Mara talking softly to Emma and Daniel, reassuring them, making plans. And for the first time since the children had arrived, Jonah allowed himself to think about what came next. They couldn't send them back out into the wilderness, not with a baby, not in winter, which meant they were staying, at least for now, and that meant everything was about to change. Later that morning, after everyone had eaten and the baby was sleeping peacefully, Jonah and Mara stepped outside. The storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in fresh snow, and the air was sharp and clean. "What do we do?" Jonah asked. Mara was quiet for a moment, her breath misting in the cold air. "We keep them. What else can we do?" "Mara, we barely have enough for ourselves. 3 more mouths." "I know." She turned to face him, and her expression was fierce. "I know it's going to be hard, but we can't turn them away. You know that. I know that." Jonah ran a hand through his hair, frustration warring with the knowledge that she was right. "This isn't what we signed up for." "No," Mara agreed, "it's not. But maybe it's what we need." "What do you mean?" "I mean—" She hesitated, searching for the words. "I've spent my whole life being unwanted, and you've spent yours alone. Maybe this is our chance to be something different, to build something that matters." Jonah stared at her, and he saw it then. The hope in her eyes, fragile and fierce, daring him to believe it too. And he realized that somewhere in the past few months, Mara had stopped being just a woman he'd chosen on a whim. She'd become someone he trusted, someone he admired, someone he... He stopped that thought before it could finish. It was too much, too soon, but the feeling was there, undeniable and growing. "All right," he said finally. "We'll figure it out." Mara's face broke into a smile, and she reached out, squeezing his hand. "Thank you." Jonah squeezed back, and they stood there together, looking out at the frozen world, knowing that their quiet, solitary life was over. And maybe that was all right. The days that followed were chaotic in a way Jonah had never experienced. The cabin, which had felt spacious for 2, was suddenly cramped with 5. Emma and Daniel needed clothes, food, reassurance. Grace needed constant care, feeding, changing, soothing when she cried in the night. Mara threw herself into it with a determination that bordered on obsession, and Jonah did his best to keep up. He expanded the sleeping arrangements, building a simple platform in the corner for the older children and fashioning a makeshift cradle for the baby. He hunted more, fished more, rationed their supplies with careful precision, and slowly, day by day, they adapted. Emma proved to be resilient, taking on tasks without being asked, helping Mara with the cooking, mending clothes, entertaining Grace when she was fussy. Daniel was quieter, more withdrawn, but Jonah recognized the look in his eyes, The boy was carrying a weight, the responsibility of keeping his sisters alive, and it had aged him beyond his years. One afternoon, Jonah found Daniel outside, staring at the mountains with an expression Jonah knew too well. "You thinking about leaving?" Jonah asked. Daniel startled, then shook his head. "No, I keep thinking about my father, about how he'd want me to take care of them. You have been. But I couldn't save him, and I almost lost Grace." Jonah studied the boy for a long moment, then said, "You got them here. That's what matters. The rest, that's on all of us now." Daniel looked at him, surprise flickering across his face. "You mean you're keeping us?" "Looks that way." "Why?" It was the same question Emma had asked Mara, and Jonah gave the same answer. "Because someone should." Daniel's throat worked, and he nodded once, sharp and grateful. Then he turned and went back inside, and Jonah stood there feeling the weight of the promise he'd just made. That night, as they all sat around the fire, Emma and Daniel playing a simple game with stones, Grace sleeping in Mara's arms, Jonah felt something settle in his chest. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was close. Mara caught his eye across the room and smiled, and Jonah found himself smiling back. They were building something here, something messy and complicated and utterly unexpected. But it was theirs. And for the first time in his life, Jonah Reed wasn't afraid of what that meant. March arrived with a thaw that turned the world into mud and slush, and with it came the realization that their supplies wouldn't last. Jonah had planned for 2 people through winter, not 5, and the children ate with the desperate efficiency of those who'd known hunger too well. He sat up one night doing calculations by candlelight, tallying what they had against what they'd need to make it to spring planting, and the numbers didn't balance. Mara found him there, hunched over scraps of paper, his face drawn with worry. "How bad?" she asked quietly, careful not to wake the children. "Bad enough." Jonah rubbed his eyes. "We've got maybe 3 weeks of flour left. A month of dried meat if we're careful. The root vegetables are nearly gone." Mara sat down across from him, her expression thoughtful. "We could go to town, trade for supplies." "With what? We've got nothing left to trade." "Then we ask for credit, or—" She hesitated. "Or we ask for help." Jonah's jaw tightened. The idea of asking for help, of admitting he couldn't provide, went against everything he'd built his life around. Self-sufficiency wasn't just a principle. It was armor. The moment you depended on others, you gave them power over you. "I know what you're thinking," Mara said, reading his face with the accuracy she'd developed over months of close quarters. "But this isn't just about pride anymore. We've got 3 children depending on us." "I know that." "Then let go of the idea that you have to do everything yourself." Her voice was gentle but firm. "That's not strength, Jonah. That's just fear." The words hit harder than any blow. Jonah wanted to argue, to deny it, but he couldn't, because she was right. He'd been afraid for so long, afraid of attachment, of vulnerability, of needing anyone, that he'd built his entire existence around avoiding it. But that life was gone now, irrevocably changed the moment he'd chosen Mara, and again when they'd opened their door to 3 desperate children. "All right," he said finally, "we'll go to town, together." Mara reached across the table and took his hand, and the simple gesture steadied him more than he wanted to admit. They left 2 days later, the 5 of them piled onto the wagon Jonah had borrowed from his closest neighbor, a gruff homesteader named Samuel, who lived 5 miles east and who'd been surprisingly understanding when Jonah had shown up asking for the loan. Emma held Grace in the back, wrapped in every blanket they could spare, while Daniel sat up front with Jonah and Mara, his young face set with determination. The trip took most of the day, the road still muddy and treacherous from the thaw. They arrived in Ember Hollow just before dusk, and Jonah felt every eye in town turn toward them. News traveled fast in small settlements, and he knew people would be talking about the children, about Mara, about what kind of fool took in orphans when he could barely feed himself. Let them talk. He didn't care anymore. They went first to the trading post, where Clarence Hooper looked up from his ledger with undisguised surprise. "Jonah Reed," Hooper said, his eyes sliding to Mara and then to the children crowded in the doorway. "Heard you'd taken in some strays. Didn't quite believe it." We need supplies, Jonah said, ignoring the comment. Flour, cornmeal, salt, whatever dried goods you can spare. Hooper's smile was oily. That's going to cost you, and I don't see any pelts or coin. I'll work it off. I can hunt, trap, do carpentry. That's a lot of debt for a man in your position. Jonah felt his temper rising, but before he could respond, Mara stepped forward. We're not asking for charity, she said, her voice cool and level. We're asking for fair terms. My husband is offering labor in exchange for goods. That's standard practice. Hooper's eyes narrowed at the word husband, and Jonah realized with a start that he and Mara had never made their arrangement official. In the eyes of the law, they were still just two people living together. But Mara had claimed the title without hesitation, and Jonah felt something warm unfurl in his chest. Fine, Hooper said after a long moment, but I want the debt settled by summer, and I'm charging interest. Half the standard rate, Mara countered. We're taking on children no one else wanted. That should count for something. Hooper looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Mara's expression, that quiet, unyielding strength, made him reconsider. Fine. Half rate. But I want it in writing. They drew up the agreement, Jonah signing with a mixture of relief and resentment. He hated being in debt, hated the feeling of obligation. But as they loaded the supplies onto the wagon, Emma and Daniel helping with wide-eyed wonder at the sudden abundance, he realized it didn't matter. His pride wasn't worth more than their survival. They were about to leave when a voice called out behind them. Jonah Reed! Jonah turned to see a woman approaching, middle-aged, with kind eyes and worn hands. He recognized her vaguely as someone who lived on the other side of town, though he'd never learned her name. I'm Margaret Talbot, she said, offering a smile. I heard about what you and your wife did, taking in those children. We're just doing what needed to be done, Jonah said, uncomfortable with the attention. Still, that's a noble thing. Margaret glanced at the wagon, at the children peering out from beneath the canvas. I wanted to offer some help. I've got clothes my boys have outgrown and some preserves I put up last summer. You're welcome to them. Jonah started to refuse. Instinct, habit, but Mara cut him off. That's very kind, Mara said warmly. We'd be grateful. Margaret beamed. I'll have my husband bring them by next week. And if you need anything else, advice about the little one, or just someone to talk to, my door's always open. Thank you, Mara said, and she meant it. Jonah could hear it in her voice. As Margaret walked away, Jonah looked at Mara. You're better at this than I am. At what? Accepting help. Letting people in. Mara's expression softened. I've had practice being on the other side. I know what it feels like when no one reaches out. So when someone does, I don't take it for granted. Jonah nodded slowly, understanding settling over him. He'd spent so long keeping the world at arm's length that he'd forgotten how to let it in. But Mara hadn't. For all her years of rejection, she still had the capacity for connection, and she was teaching him, day by day, how to do the same. They made one more stop before leaving town, the small office where the territorial judge conducted business once a month. Jonah had been thinking about it since Mara had called him her husband, and he'd realized something. He wanted it to be true. The judge was a weary-looking man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He looked up when they entered, children in tow, and raised an eyebrow. Can I help you? We want to get married, Jonah said, officially. The judge blinked. Both of you? Yes, Mara said, her hand finding Jonah's. Both of us. Well, the judge shuffled some papers. I suppose I can do that. You'll need witnesses. Jonah looked around helplessly. They didn't know anyone well enough to ask, but then Daniel stepped forward. We'll do it, the boy said. Emma and me. We'll witness. The judge looked dubious. Your children. We're family, Emma said firmly, Grace in her arms, and family witnesses. Something in the girl's fierce determination must have convinced the judge, because he sighed and pulled out the necessary forms. 10 minutes later, Jonah and Mara stood before him, hands clasped, while he read through the brief ceremony. Do you, Jonah Reed, take this woman as your lawfully wedded wife? Jonah looked at Mara, at the woman who'd been unwanted, who'd worked herself to the bone to prove her worth, who'd fought through the night to save a dying baby. the woman who'd somehow become the center of everything. "I do," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "And do you, Mara Ellison, take this man as your lawfully wedded husband?" Mara's eyes shone with tears, but her voice was steady. "I do." Then by the power vested in me by the Montana Territory, I pronounce you husband and wife." The judge looked faintly amused. "You may kiss the bride, I suppose." Jonah hesitated. They'd never kissed, never even come close, but Mara smiled and leaned up, pressing her lips to his in a brief, gentle touch. It was chaste, almost formal, but it sent a shock through Jonah's entire body. When they pulled apart, Emma was crying, and Daniel was grinning, and even Grace seemed to sense the importance of the moment, cooing softly. "Congratulations," the judge said dryly, handing them the certificate. "Try to stay alive out there." They left Ember Hollow as the sun was setting, the wagon heavier with supplies and something else, a sense of legitimacy, of permanence. Jonah drove in silence for a while, processing everything that had happened. Beside him, Mara sat with Grace in her lap, humming a soft tune that made the baby's eyes droop. "Are you all right?" Mara asked quietly. Jonah glanced at her. "Yeah, I think I am." "No regrets? About marrying you?" He shook his head. "No, about anything else either." Mara smiled, and in the fading light, she looked almost radiant. "Good, because I don't regret it either." They made it home well after dark, exhausted but strangely content. The children helped unload the supplies, their energy renewed by the prospect of full meals ahead, and Mara set about organizing everything while Jonah tended to the horse. By the time he came back inside, the cabin smelled like coffee and fresh bread. Margaret had sent a loaf along with them, and the fire was crackling warmly. It felt, for the first time, like home. Over the following weeks, a rhythm established itself. Jonah worked from dawn to dusk, preparing the land for planting, repairing winter damage, hunting to supplement their stores. Daniel shadowed him everywhere, eager to learn, and Jonah found himself teaching the boy the skills his own father had taught him: how to read the weather, how to track game, how to fix what was broken and make do with what you had. The boy was a quick study, his hands becoming more confident with each passing day. Jonah watched him split wood one morning, his form improving, his aim true, and felt a swell of pride that surprised him with its intensity. "You're getting good at that," Jonah said. Daniel paused, wiping sweat from his brow. Really? Really, your father would have been proud." The boy's face lit up, then shadowed. "Do you think about him? My father?" "Sometimes. I never met him, but I think about what kind of man he must have been to raise kids like you and Emma. That takes strength." "He was a good man," Daniel said softly. "He worked hard, he loved us. He couldn't fight the fever." "No one can fight fever," Jonah said. "That's not weakness. That's just life out here." Daniel nodded, his throat working. "I'm glad we found you. And Mara, I know we're not really yours, but—" "You are," Jonah interrupted. "You're mine, all three of you. Blood doesn't make family, Daniel. Choice does. And I choose you." The boy's eyes went bright with tears, and he ducked his head, swiping at them quickly. "Thanks," he managed. Jonah clapped him on the shoulder, feeling the solid weight of him, and realized how much the boy had grown in just a few months. He was filling out, his shoulders broadening, his voice deepening. Soon, he'd be a man. And Jonah wanted to make sure he was ready. "Come on," Jonah said. "Let's check the trap line. I want to show you how to read the signs." They spent the afternoon in the woods, Jonah teaching Daniel how to spot disturbed earth, broken twigs, the subtle indicators that animals left behind. The boy absorbed everything, asking intelligent questions, making connections Jonah didn't have to spell out. "You're a natural at this," Jonah said as they walked back toward the cabin, 3 rabbits hanging from Daniel's belt. "I like it," Daniel admitted. "Being out here, learning. It makes me feel—" He searched for the word. "Useful." "You are useful. More than that. You're capable. And that's something to be proud of." Daniel smiled, genuine and full, and Jonah felt that pride surge again. This was what it meant to be a father, he realized. Not just providing shelter and food, but building someone up, showing them their own worth, preparing them for the world. Meanwhile, inside the cabin, Mara was doing the same with Emma. The girl had taken to domestic work with enthusiasm, but Mara was careful to teach her more than just cooking and cleaning. She showed Emma how to read and write, skills Mara had learned haphazardly over the years and was determined to pass on. They sat together in the afternoons, Emma bent over a slate, practicing her letters while Grace played at their feet. "Why is learning important?" Emma asked one day. "Because it gives you choices," Mara said. "A woman who can read and write and cipher isn't dependent on anyone to tell her what's what. She can make her own way." Emma looked up, her young face serious. "Is that what you did? Made your own way?" "I tried to," Mara said. "It wasn't always easy, but knowing how to read saved me more than once, helped me understand contracts, keep myself from being cheated, write letters when I needed help." "Did anyone ever help you?" Mara thought about that, about all the times she'd asked and been turned away. "Not until Jonah. He was the first person who chose to help without asking what I could give him in return." "He's a good man," Emma said. "He is, and you're a good girl, smart and capable and kind." Mara squeezed Emma's hand. "Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." Emma's eyes filled with tears, and she leaned against Mara, who wrapped her arms around the girl and held her close. Grace toddled over, sensing the emotion, and climbed into Mara's lap too, creating a tangle of limbs and affection that made Mara's heart ache with fullness. This was what she dreamed of as a lonely child, being surrounded by people who loved her, who wanted her there, who saw her as more than just a burden. And now she had it. Against all odds, despite every rejection and hardship, she'd found her place. One evening, as they all sat down to dinner, a real dinner, with fresh vegetables from the garden they'd started and bread Mara had baked, Jonah looked around the table and felt something shift inside him. This was it. This was what he'd been missing all those years alone in the mountains. Not just companionship, but purpose. Not just survival, but life. "I want to say something," he announced, and everyone looked up. "I know this hasn't been easy. We've had hard days and harder nights. But I want you all to know, Emma, Daniel, Grace, you're not just staying here temporarily. This is your home, for as long as you want it to be." Emma's eyes filled with tears, and Daniel's throat worked as he tried to swallow around the emotion. "You mean it?" Emma asked. "I mean it," Jonah said. "We're a family now, and family doesn't give up on each other." "Thank you," Daniel said, his voice rough, "for everything, for not turning us away." "You don't have to thank us," Mara said gently. "You're ours now, and we're yours." Grace banged her spoon on the table, oblivious to the weight of the moment, but somehow adding to it, and everyone laughed. The sound filled the cabin, warm and real and alive. Later, after the children were asleep and the dishes were clean, Jonah and Mara stood together in the doorway, looking out at the land they'd claimed, the life they'd built. "Do you ever miss it?" Mara asked. "The quiet? The solitude?" Jonah considered the question honestly. Did he miss it? The simplicity, the lack of responsibility, the freedom to answer to no one but himself? "Sometimes," he admitted, "but not enough to go back." "Me neither." They stood in comfortable silence, and Jonah realized something profound. He'd spent 15 years believing that solitude was safety, that needing no one meant never being hurt. But he'd been wrong. True safety wasn't in isolation. It was in connection, in building something strong enough to weather the storms, in choosing people and letting them choose you back. "We did good," he said quietly. "We did," Mara agreed. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the night settled around them, Jonah Reed, the man who'd chosen the woman no one wanted, knew with absolute certainty that he'd never made a better choice in his life. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Jonah was outside working on the corral when he heard horses approaching. He straightened, hand instinctively moving toward the rifle leaning against the fence, then relaxed when he recognized Samuel Talbot, Margaret's husband, along with 2 other men from the settlement. "Morning, Jonah," Samuel called out, reining in his horse. "Hope we're not interrupting." "Not at all," Jonah said, though his wariness remained. 3 men showing up unannounced usually meant trouble or obligation, neither of which he welcomed. Samuel dismounted, followed by the others, Peter Hendricks, who ran a small ranch to the south, and James Crawford, the blacksmith. Good men, all of them, but Jonah couldn't imagine why they'd ridden all this way. "We heard about your situation," Samuel said without preamble. "Taking in those orphans, and we figured you could use some help getting ready for planting season." Jonah blinked. "Help?" "That's right." Peter gestured to the wagon behind them, loaded with tools and supplies. "We brought seed, some lumber for expanding your cabin, and a few extra hands for the day. Figure between all of us, we can get your fields ready and maybe add that room you'll be needing." Jonah's throat tightened. "I can't pay you." "Who asked you to?" James said gruffly. "You're doing something good here, Reed. Taking care of kids who'd otherwise have nowhere to go. That deserves support." "Besides," Samuel added with a slight smile, "Margaret would have my hide if I didn't come help. And trust me, you don't want to cross Margaret." Jonah didn't know what to say. He'd spent so long handling everything alone, the concept of freely offered help was almost foreign. But before he could formulate a response, Mara emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. "Gentlemen," she said warmly, "this is very kind of you. Please, come in. I'll put coffee on." "Much obliged, ma'am," Samuel said, tipping his hat. As the men began unloading supplies, Daniel appeared at Jonah's elbow, his eyes wide. "Are they really going to help us?" the boy whispered. "Looks that way," Jonah said, still processing. "Why?" It was a fair question. Jonah looked at the boy, at his confusion and wonder, and realized this was a teaching moment. "Because that's what communities do," he said. "When one person needs help, others step in, not for payment or recognition, but because it's right." "But you always said we had to do everything ourselves." "I was wrong about that," Jonah admitted. "Being self-sufficient is important, but so is knowing when to accept help, and how to give it when others need it." Daniel absorbed this, nodding slowly. Then his face brightened. "Can I help them?" "Absolutely. Go ask Mr. Talbot what needs doing." The boy ran off, eager and energized, and Jonah watched him go with a mixture of pride and melancholy. Daniel was learning lessons Jonah had taken decades to understand. Maybe that was what it meant to be a good father, ensuring your children didn't repeat your mistakes. The day transformed into something Jonah had never experienced. The men worked together with easy camaraderie, teaching Daniel as they went, while Emma helped Mara prepare a large midday meal for everyone. Even Grace participated in her own way, toddling around and distributing tools, mostly sticks and rocks, to anyone who'd accept them with appropriate seriousness. By midday, they'd plowed 2 full fields, laid the foundation for the new room, and repaired sections of fencing that Jonah had been meaning to get to for months. They broke for lunch, crowding into and around the cabin, filling it with laughter and conversation. "Your wife's a fine cook," Peter said to Jonah, working through his second helping of stew. "She is," Jonah agreed, watching Mara move among their guests, ensuring everyone had enough, her face bright with pleasure at being able to provide hospitality. "And those children," James added, "well-mannered, you're doing right by them." "Trying to," Jonah said. "Some days are harder than others." "That's parenthood," Samuel said with a knowing chuckle. "But you keep showing up, keep trying, and eventually they turn out all right. Margaret and I have 4 boys. Each one tested us in different ways, but we wouldn't trade a single moment." Jonah glanced at Daniel, who was sitting with the men, listening intently to their stories about homesteading and survival. The boy caught his eye and smiled, and Jonah felt that now familiar surge of protective affection. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose you wouldn't." After lunch, they returned to work, and by late afternoon, the transformation was remarkable. The fields were ready for planting, the new room's frame was up, and various repairs had been completed that would have taken Jonah weeks to accomplish alone. As the men prepared to leave, Samuel pulled Jonah aside. "I know this is hard for you," he said. "Accepting help. Margaret told me about your history, about how you've always kept to yourself." Jonah stiffened slightly, uncomfortable with being so transparent. "But here's the thing," Samuel continued. "You've got a family now, and families need community. Not just for the practical stuff, but for the connection, for knowing you're not alone when things get hard." He paused. "And they will get hard, Jonah. That's guaranteed. But with people around you, it's bearable." "I'm not used to depending on others," Jonah admitted. "Then get used to it. Because those children are watching you. They're learning how to be in the world based on what you show them. Do you want them to think they have to handle everything alone? Or do you want them to know that asking for help is a strength, not a weakness? The words hit home, sharp and true. Jonah thought about Daniel's question earlier, why? And realized Samuel was right. He was teaching his children through example, and he needed to teach them better than he'd been taught. You're right, Jonah said. Thank you. For today and for the perspective. Samuel clapped him on the shoulder. Anytime. And I mean that. If you need something, you ask. That's what neighbors are for. As the men rode away, Jonah stood watching until they disappeared into the distance. Mara came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his. That was good, she said. It was, Jonah agreed. I'm not sure I deserved it, but it was good. You did deserve it. We both did. Mara looked up at him. You've spent so long thinking you had to earn everything, prove your worth every day. But sometimes people help just because they want to, because they see something good and they want to support it. Is that what we are? Something good? Yes, us, Mara said firmly. We're taking care of children who needed us. We're building a home. We're trying to be better than we were. That's about as good as it gets. Jonah pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. When did you get so wise? I've always been wise. You just didn't notice. He laughed, the sound surprising him. When had laughter become so easy? When had joy become something he expected rather than feared? That night, as they lay in bed, their new official status as husband and wife still feeling novel, Mara said, I have something to tell you. Jonah propped himself up on one elbow, studying her face in the dim light from the dying fire. There was something in her expression, nervous, hopeful, afraid, that made his heart skip. What is it? I'm pregnant. The words came out in a rush, like she'd been holding them back for days. I'm fairly certain. All the signs are there, and She stopped, searching his face. Say something. Jonah opened his mouth, but no words came. Pregnant. A baby. Their baby. The concept was so enormous, so world-altering, that his mind couldn't quite grasp it. Jonah? Mara's voice was smaller now, uncertain. If you don't want... No, he said quickly, finding his voice. No, He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. I'm just surprised. That's all. But it's good. He pulled back to look at her. Are you happy about it? Mara's eyes filled with tears. Terrified. And happy. And terrified again. Jonah laughed, relief flooding through him. Yeah, me too. They lay together in the darkness, Mara's head on his chest, his hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach. A baby. Their child. Another person to love, to protect, to teach. The responsibility should have terrified him. And it did, a little. But more than that, it filled him with a sense of rightness. This was what life was supposed to be, not just existing, but growing, building, creating something new. We should probably tell the children, Mara said after a while. Yeah, but not yet. Let's keep this to ourselves for a little while longer. Mara nodded, understanding. They needed this moment, just the two of them, before the news became real to everyone else. Jonah? Mara's voice was drowsy now, sleep pulling at her. Yeah? I love you. The words still had the power to stop his heart. I love you too. And as she drifted off to sleep, safe and warm in his arms, Jonah stared at the ceiling and thought about the future. About the child who would be born in the fall. About Emma and Daniel and Grace growing up here. About the home they were building together. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing about frontier life was easy. But they'd face it together. Him and Mara and their growing family. And that made all the difference. He fell asleep with a smile on his face, more content than he'd ever been in his entire life. The morning Mara told the children about the baby, spring had fully taken hold of the land. The meadow beyond the cabin bloomed with wildflowers, and the air carried the scent of new growth and possibility. They gathered around the breakfast table, Grace in her high chair banging a wooden spoon, Emma and Daniel alert to the fact that something important was about to be said. Mara glanced at Jonah, who nodded encouragingly, then took a breath. "We have some news," she began, her hands folded on the table. "Come fall, we're going to have a new addition to the family. I'm going to have a baby." For a moment there was absolute silence. Then Emma's face broke into a radiant smile. "Really? A baby?" She looked between Mara and Jonah, her eyes shining. "Our baby?" "Yes," Mara said, her own smile growing. "Your brother or sister?" Emma let out a squeal of delight and jumped up to hug Mara, careful of her middle even though there was nothing to see yet. "This is wonderful. I can help take care of it and teach it things, and oh, we'll need baby clothes and a cradle, and—" "Easy there," Jonah said with a laugh. "We've got time to prepare." Daniel had been quiet, his expression complex. Now he spoke, his voice careful. "Are you happy about it, Ma?" The word, Ma, stopped Mara's heart. Daniel had never called her that before. None of them had, maintaining a respectful distance even as they'd grown closer. But now, with a baby coming, something had shifted. "I'm very happy," Mara said, her voice thick with emotion. "Scared too, but mostly happy." "Good," Daniel said, and his face broke into a grin. "Because I think it's great. Grace needs someone closer to her age anyway. She's getting tired of us old folks." Grace, hearing her name, clapped her hands and shouted, "Baby!" with such enthusiasm that everyone laughed. "So you're all right with this?" Jonah asked, wanting to be sure. "I know it means more changes, more adjustments." "We're family," Daniel said firmly. "That's what families do. They grow." Jonah felt his throat tighten with pride and love. The boy, no, the young man, had such wisdom, such generosity of spirit. He'd been shaped by loss, but not broken by it, and Jonah knew he'd played at least a small part in that resilience. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly what families do." The following weeks were marked by preparation and anticipation. Emma threw herself into making baby things with Mara's guidance, knitting tiny blankets, sewing small clothes from fabric scraps, embroidering a quilt with careful, determined stitches. Daniel worked with Jonah to expand the cabin further, adding a small alcove off the main room that would serve as a nursery. And Grace, not fully understanding but catching the excitement, took to patting Mara's stomach and saying "baby" at every opportunity. Samuel Talbot returned as promised, this time with lumber and tools to help build a proper cradle. He worked alongside Jonah and Daniel, showing them techniques for joinery and finishing that created something both beautiful and functional. "A child's first bed should be made with love," Samuel said as they sanded the wood smooth. "My father told me that, and I've passed it on to my boys. Now I'm passing it to you." Daniel absorbed every word, his hands moving carefully over the wood, and Jonah watched the boy's confidence grow with each passing day. He was becoming someone, not just surviving, but thriving. They all were. One afternoon, as Mara rested, the pregnancy making her tired in these early months, Margaret Talbot arrived with a basket full of baby supplies and advice. "I've brought everything you'll need," Margaret said, unpacking jars of salve, stacks of cloth diapers, and a collection of tiny gowns. "And I want you to know, when your time comes, I'll be here to help. I've birthed 4 of my own and assisted with a dozen others. You'll be in good hands." "Thank you," Mara said, overwhelmed by the generosity. "I don't know how to repay all this kindness." "You don't repay it," Margaret said gently. "You pass it on. When someone else needs help, you give it. That's how community works." After Margaret left, Mara sat surrounded by baby things, tears streaming down her face. Emma found her like that and immediately grew concerned. "Ma, what's wrong? Are you hurt?" "No, sweetheart," Mara said, pulling the girl close. "I'm just overwhelmed. A year ago I had nothing and no one, and now—" She gestured at the abundance around them. "Now I have everything." Emma hugged her tight. "You deserve it. You're the best mother anyone could ask for." The words broke something open in Mara, and she wept properly then, releasing years of loneliness and rejection, letting them wash away in the face of this new reality. Emma held her through it all, this brave, resilient girl who'd learned too young how to comfort others. When Jonah came in later and found them like that, he didn't ask questions. He just sat down and wrapped his arms around both of them, creating a cocoon of safety and love. As spring moved toward summer, the homestead became a hub of activity. The fields produced their first real crop, promising a harvest that would see them through the next winter with plenty to spare. The garden flourished under Emma's careful tending, providing fresh vegetables that transformed their meals. And the children grew, not just physically, but in confidence and capability. Daniel shot his first deer in early June, a clean kill that he accomplished entirely on his own. He came back to the cabin glowing with pride, and Jonah clasped his shoulder with genuine respect. "Well done, son," he said. "You're a true hunter now." "Pa taught me everything," Daniel said to Emma later, his voice full of admiration. "How to track, how to be patient, how to make the shot count. He's the best teacher." Emma smiled, looking up from the shirt she was mending. "He's the best father, too. We're lucky he chose us." "We chose each other," Daniel corrected. "That's what makes it real." The boy was right, Jonah thought, overhearing from where he worked outside. They had chosen each other, and that choice, renewed every day through countless small actions, was what made them a family. One evening in late June, Jonah suggested they take a trip back to Ember Hollow. They needed a few supplies, but more than that, he wanted to show the town what they'd built, to stand together as a family and claim their place in the community without shame or hesitation. They arrived on a Saturday when the town was busiest and walked down Main Street together, Jonah and Mara, Emma carrying Grace, Daniel walking tall beside them. People stared as Jonah had known they would, but this time their stares held curiosity and respect rather than judgment. They stopped first at the trading post, where Clarence Hooper looked up from his ledger and actually smiled. "Reed family," he said. "Good to see you. I hear congratulations are in order." "Word travels fast," Jonah said. "Always does in small towns." Hooper tallied their purchases, flour, sugar, a few other essentials, and marked it against their account. "You're making good progress on that debt. Keep this up and you'll be clear by harvest." "That's the plan," Jonah said, handing over several pelts he'd trapped. "These should help." Hooper examined the pelts with a professional eye and nodded approvingly. "Quality work. Your boy do any of these?" "3 of them," Jonah said proudly. "He's got good hands." Daniel flushed with pleasure at the praise, standing a little straighter. As they left the trading post, they encountered several townspeople who stopped to greet them, offering congratulations on the baby, asking about the children, expressing genuine interest in their lives. It was overwhelming in the best way, this sudden acceptance, this sense of belonging. They made their way to the judge's office, where Jonah had one final piece of business to conduct. "We want to make the adoption official," he said without preamble. "Legal and binding. Emma, Daniel, and Grace Reed." The judge looked up, his tired eyes brightening slightly. "I was wondering when you'd come. Been waiting on those papers for weeks. Figured you'd get around to it eventually." "You knew we'd want this?" Mara asked. "Anyone with eyes could see you're a family," the judge said, "but making it legal gives those children protection, rights, a future." He pulled out the necessary documents. "This is good work you're doing, both of you." Plus, the paperwork took less than an hour, but its significance was profound. When they walked out of that office, Emma, Daniel, and Grace were legally Reeds, no longer orphans, no longer in legal limbo, but permanent members of the family with all the rights and protections that entailed. Emma cried, Daniel tried not to and failed, and Grace, sensing the emotion but not understanding, patted everyone's faces and said family over and over until they were all laughing through their tears. "Can we go to the general store?" Emma asked once they'd composed themselves. "I want to buy fabric for the baby's quilt, with my own money." Jonah raised an eyebrow. "Your own money?" Emma pulled a small cloth purse from her pocket, jingling with coins. "I've been selling eggs to Mrs. Henderson. She pays me 2 cents a dozen. I've saved up almost $1. Jonah looked at Mara, who shrugged with a smile. "She asked if she could. I didn't see any reason to say no." "That's..." Jonah struggled to find words for the pride he felt. "That's very entrepreneurial of you, Emma." "I don't know what that means, but thank you," Emma said seriously. At the general store, Emma deliberated over fabric choices with the intense focus of someone making a critical decision. She finally selected a soft yellow cotton and a pale green calico, both perfect for a baby. "Yellow for sunshine," she explained to Daniel. and green for growth. Sounds perfect, her brother said, then added quietly to Jonah, she's going to be a great big sister. She already is, Jonah said, watching Emma carefully count out her coins to pay for the fabric. As they prepared to leave town, they encountered one final person, the woman who'd stood beside Mara on that bride call platform nearly a year ago. She was alone, looking thin and worn, her eyes hollow with disappointment or resignation. Mara stopped, and after a moment's hesitation approached her. "Hello," Mara said gently. The woman looked up, recognition flickering across her face. "You're the one that man chose, the scarred one." "I am," Mara said evenly. "My name is Mara Reed now." The woman's eyes went to Jonah, then to the children, then back to Mara's slightly rounded belly. You look happy." "I am happy," Mara said. "Very happy. Did you find a match?" The woman's face crumpled slightly. "I did, but he wasn't." She stopped, unable to continue. Mara reached out and squeezed her hand. "I'm sorry, I know what it's like to feel unwanted." "But you're not unwanted now," the woman said, something like wonder in her voice. "You have all this." "I do," Mara agreed, "and I hope you find the same. You deserve happiness too." The woman nodded, tears in her eyes, and Mara rejoined her family. As they walked away, Emma slipped her hand into Mara's. "That was kind of you," Emma said, "talking to her like that." "She needed someone to see her," Mara said. "The way your father saw me." "He has good eyes," Emma said solemnly, and Jonah laughed despite himself. They traveled home in the golden light of late afternoon, the wagon loaded with supplies and their hearts full of contentment. When the cabin came into view, Daniel said, "It looks different now." "How so?" Jonah asked. "I don't know. Fuller, maybe. Like it's actually alive." Jonah understood exactly what he meant. The cabin had transformed from a shelter into a home, and the difference was palpable. It breathed with their presence, held their laughter, bore witness to their growing love. That night, after the children were asleep, Jonah and Mara sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. "Thank you," Mara said softly. "For what?" "For today. For making the adoption official. For showing me, showing all of us, that we matter." "You've always mattered," Jonah said. "I just wish I'd understood that sooner. Wish I'd known years ago that life was better with people in it. You know now, that's what counts." Jonah pulled her close, his hand resting on her growing belly. "I spent 15 years alone, convincing myself I was better off that way. And then you came along and proved me wrong about everything." "Not wrong," Mara corrected. "Just incomplete. You needed to find the right people. We all did." "Are we the right people for each other?" "Yes," Mara said with absolute certainty. "We absolutely are." Summer deepened, bringing long days of work and longer evenings of contentment. The crops flourished, the animals multiplied, and the homestead took on the character of permanence. Neighbors visited regularly, and the Reed family became fixtures at community gatherings, barn raisings, harvest planning meetings, simple social calls that knitted them deeper into the fabric of frontier life. Jonah found himself part of conversations about shared resources, about helping new settlers, about building a school when enough families had children of learning age. He contributed ideas, offered labor, accepted help in return. The transformation was remarkable, from a man who wanted nothing to do with anyone to someone actively shaping his community. Daniel flourished under this attention, learning not just from Jonah, but from all the men who passed through their lives. He absorbed knowledge about farming from Samuel, smithing from James, animal husbandry from Peter. By midsummer, he was nearly as tall as Jonah, his voice fully deepened, his confidence solid. "You're becoming a man," Jonah told him one evening as they finished the day's work. Daniel looked at him seriously. "Will I be a good one? Like you?" The question caught Jonah off guard. "I'm not sure I'm that good a man." "You are," Daniel said firmly. "You took us in when no one else would. You work hard, you're patient, you teach us things, and you love Ma like she's the most important person in the world." "She is," Jonah said simply, "and so are you kids." Daniel smiled, then said, When the baby comes, will you love it more than us? Jonah heard the vulnerability beneath the question, the old fear that love was finite, that new arrivals meant displaced affections. No, he said firmly. Love doesn't work like that. It doesn't divide. It multiplies. I'll love the baby, yes, but that won't make me love you any less. You understand? Daniel nodded slowly. Yeah, I think I do. You're my son, Daniel. That's not going to change because another child comes along. You're mine, and I'm yours, and that's permanent. The boy's eyes shone with tears, but he blinked them back and cleared his throat. Thanks, Pa. I needed to hear that. As autumn approached and Mara's pregnancy advanced, the cabin buzzed with preparation. The cradle sat ready, lined with the softest blankets. Baby clothes had been washed and folded, stacked carefully in the new alcove. Margaret had visited twice, checking on Mara's progress and assuring them that everything looked normal and healthy. Emma had finished the baby's quilt, a beautiful patchwork of yellows and greens, with each family member's name embroidered in one corner. She presented it to Mara one evening with shy pride. It's for the baby, she said, so it knows it's loved from the very beginning. Mara held the quilt to her chest, tears streaming down her face. It's beautiful, sweetheart. The baby will treasure it always. I put all our names on it, Emma explained, yours and Pa's, mine and Daniel's and Grace's, so the baby knows it belongs to all of us. That's perfect, Mara said, pulling Emma into a hug. You're perfect. The baby came on a crisp October morning, arriving with the kind of dramatic timing that seemed fitting for a child born into such an unlikely family. Mara's labor started just before dawn, and by mid-morning it was clear the birth was imminent. Margaret arrived quickly, summoned by Daniel on horseback, and took charge with calm efficiency. Jonah paced outside with the children, his nerves stretched impossibly thin, every sound from inside the cabin making his heart race. Emma clutched Grace, both girls' faces tense with worry. Daniel stood beside Jonah, trying to appear calm but fooling no one. She'll be all right, Daniel said, more prayer than certainty. She has to be. She will be, Jonah said, hoping he sounded more confident than he felt. Your mother is strong. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness, and then, finally, the unmistakable sound of a newborn's cry pierced the air. Jonah's knees nearly buckled with relief. Daniel grabbed his arm to steady him, and Emma started crying, and Grace said, "Baby!" with such joy that it cut through the tension. Margaret emerged a few minutes later, tired but smiling. You have a son, and Mara's doing fine, tired but fine. She's asking for you. Jonah rushed inside to find Mara propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, a tiny bundle in her arms. She looked up when he entered, and her smile was everything. Come meet your son, she said. Jonah approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the baby for the first time. He was small, red-faced, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that were just beginning to focus. One tiny fist was curled against his cheek, and as Jonah watched, the baby yawned, a huge yawn for such a small creature. He's perfect, Jonah breathed. He is, Mara agreed. What should we name him? They'd discussed names, but standing here with their son actually in the world, Jonah knew exactly what felt right. Samuel, he said. After the first neighbor who helped us, the first person who showed me that accepting help wasn't weakness. Mara's eyes filled with tears. Samuel Reed. I love it. We can call him Sam, Jonah added, reaching out to touch the baby's impossibly soft cheek. Sam made a small sound, something between a coo and a complaint, and both parents laughed. He has opinions already, Mara said. Takes after his mother, Jonah teased gently. The children were allowed in then, and they crowded around the bed with hushed reverence. Emma reached out tentatively and touched Sam's hand, and the baby's fingers closed around hers reflexively. He's so tiny, Emma whispered, wonder in her voice. You were this small once, Mara told her. All of you were. Grace toddled closer and peered at the baby with intense curiosity. Baby Sam, she declared, patting his blanket. That's right, Jonah said, scooping Grace up so she could see better. Your brother Sam. Daniel hung back slightly, his expression complex. Happy, but also contemplative. Jonah understood. The boy was thinking about his own family, about the siblings he'd fought so hard to protect, about the father he'd lost. Jonah set Grace down and crossed to Daniel, putting a hand on his shoulder. "You all right, son?" Daniel nodded, but his eyes were bright with tears. "I was just thinking, my father would have loved to meet Sam, to see all of this." "I bet he's watching," Jonah said quietly, "and I bet he's proud of the man you're becoming. The way you've taken care of your sisters, the strength you've shown, that's his legacy in you." Daniel's face crumpled, and he leaned into Jonah, who wrapped his arms around the boy and held him tight. "I'm proud of you too," Jonah said. "So proud. You're a good man, Daniel Reed, and you're going to be an amazing big brother to Sam." "Thanks, Pa," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. They stood like that for a long moment, and Jonah felt the weight of fatherhood settle more firmly on his shoulders. Not just to Sam, but to all of them, these children who'd been given to him by circumstance and choice, who'd become his in every way that mattered. The days following Sam's birth were chaotic in the best possible way. The baby demanded attention at all hours, and Mara was exhausted, so the household rallied around her. Emma took over most of the cooking, surprising everyone with her competence. Daniel handled the outdoor chores without being asked, and Grace, delighted by her new sibling, insisted on helping with everything, fetching diapers, singing nonsense songs, patting Sam's back when he fussed. Neighbors stopped by with food and congratulations and advice. Margaret came daily to check on Mara and the baby, pronouncing them both healthy and thriving. Samuel brought a rocking chair he'd made specifically for nursing, and other families contributed blankets, clothes, and precious jars of preserved food. "This is what community looks like," Margaret told Jonah one afternoon as they stood watching the children play outside. "People taking care of each other." "I'm still getting used to it," Jonah admitted. "You're doing fine. Better than fine. You're thriving. All of you are." Jonah looked at his family, at Emma helping Grace stack stones, at Daniel chopping wood with strong, sure strokes, at Mara visible through the window rocking Sam, and realized Margaret was right. They were thriving. One evening, about 2 weeks after Sam's birth, Jonah found Mara sitting by the window, nursing the baby while watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, settling beside her. "Everything," Mara said. "How we got here. How different our lives are now. Better different? The best different." She looked at him, her face soft with contentment. "A year and a half ago, I stood on that platform convinced my life was over, that I'd never be wanted, never belong anywhere. And now," her voice broke, "now I have everything I ever dreamed of and more." "You deserve it all," Jonah said fiercely. "Every bit of happiness, every moment of peace. You deserve to be loved and wanted and treasured." "So do you," Mara said. "You spent so long alone thinking you were better off that way. But look at what we've built together. Look at this family." Jonah looked at Sam, sleeping peacefully in Mara's arms, tiny and perfect, and theirs. "I never knew," he said quietly. "I never knew life could be like this." "Like what?" "Full, rich, worth living." He met her eyes. "You did that, Mara. You showed me what I was missing." "We did it together," Mara corrected. "You chose me when no one else would. You gave me a chance. Everything that came after. We built that side by side." Sam stirred, making small sounds, and Mara adjusted him gently. Jonah watched her with their son, marveling at how natural she was, how perfectly she'd stepped into motherhood despite having no real example to follow. "You're an amazing mother," he said. "I'm trying," Mara said. "Sometimes I worry I'm not doing it right, that I'm going to mess something up." "You won't," Jonah interrupted. "You love them, all of them, and that's what matters most. Is it enough? It's everything." Winter came early that year, snow falling in late October and settling in to stay. But the Reed household was prepared, supplies stocked, repairs completed, the cabin warm and secure. They settled into the rhythm of cold weather life, days marked by indoor tasks and evenings gathered around the fire. Sam thrived, growing plump and healthy, his cries growing stronger and his smiles more frequent. Emma and Grace doted on him endlessly, while Daniel proved surprisingly adept at soothing the baby when he was fussy. "You're good at that," Mara told Daniel one evening as he walked Sam around the cabin, patting his back rhythmically. "I used to do this with Grace," Daniel said. "When she was little and Ma was—" He stopped, the memory still painful. "I guess I never forgot how." "Your mother would be proud," Mara said gently, "of the man you've become, of how you've taken care of your sisters." "Do you think about them?" Daniel asked. "Your family? The ones who didn't want you?" It was a surprisingly direct question, but Mara didn't shy from it. "Sometimes, but not with anger anymore, just sadness, maybe, for what they missed. What we all missed by not finding each other sooner." "Do you forgive them?" Mara thought about that. "I'm working on it. Forgiveness is hard, but I'm trying not to let their rejection define me anymore. I have a family now who wants me. That's what matters." Daniel nodded slowly, understanding in a way only someone who'd also lost family could. "Yeah, that is what matters." As the months passed, the household found its rhythm. Sam grew, reaching milestones that delighted everyone. His first real smile, his first laugh, the way he tracked faces with his eyes. Emma finished another quilt, this one for Grace. Daniel built a toy box, learning woodworking techniques from Jonah and Samuel, and Grace, no longer the baby, embraced her role as big sister with enthusiastic devotion. One evening in late winter, Jonah came in from evening chores to find the entire family gathered in the main room. Mara was nursing Sam, Emma was reading aloud from a book Margaret had lent them, Daniel was whittling, and Grace was playing with wooden blocks. It was such an ordinary scene, nothing dramatic or momentous, but it stopped Jonah in his tracks. This was it. This was the life he'd built. Not perfect, not without challenges, but real and solid and full of love. Mara looked up and caught his expression. "What?" she asked with a smile. "Nothing," Jonah said, hanging up his coat. "Just appreciating." "Appreciating what?" "All of this. You, them, everything we have." Emma looked up from her book. "Are you getting sentimental, Pa?" "Maybe," Jonah admitted. "Is that allowed?" "It's required," Emma said solemnly. "That's what fathers do." Everyone laughed, and Jonah settled into his chair, pulling Grace onto his lap. She snuggled against him, her thumb finding her mouth, and Jonah wrapped his arms around her and just breathed. This was what he'd been looking for his whole life without knowing it. Not solitude, not independence, not freedom from obligation, but this: connection, belonging, the sweet weight of people who needed him and whom he needed in return. As spring returned and Sam reached 6 months old, the Reed family prepared for their first full planting season together. The children had grown, Emma shooting up several inches, Daniel's shoulders broadening further, Grace talking in full sentences now. They worked as a team, each person contributing according to their abilities. One morning, as they prepared to go into town for supplies, Mara said, "I think we should bring the adoption papers, show people what we've built." "Why?" Jonah asked, curious. "Because other people need to see that families can be made, not just born, that choosing each other is just as valid as blood." So they brought the papers, and in town, they showed them to anyone who asked. The response was uniformly positive: congratulations, respect, acknowledgement that what they'd done was special. The woman Mara had encountered before, the one from the bride call, approached them hesitantly. "I heard what you did," she said, "taking in those children, making it official." "We did," Mara said. "They're ours now, completely." "That's—" The woman's voice broke. "That's beautiful. You're very lucky." "We are," Mara agreed. "But luck was just the beginning. The rest was choice. Every day we choose this, choose each other." The woman nodded, something like hope dawning in her eyes. "Maybe I can find that too." "You can," Mara said firmly. "I believe you will." As they drove home that evening, the wagon full of supplies and the children talking excitedly about the trip, Jonah reached over and took Mara's hand. "That was good," he said. "What you told her." "It was true," Mara said. "We are lucky, but we're also intentional. That makes the difference." "When did you get so wise?" Mara laughed. "I've always been wise. You're just finally noticing." That summer was the best of Jonah's life. The crops flourished, yielding more than they'd hoped. The children grew stronger and more capable. Sam hit milestone after milestone, delighting everyone. And the homestead, once just a shelter, became a true home, filled with laughter and love and the beautiful chaos of family life. On a warm evening in July, they gathered outside to watch the sunset, the whole family together. Sam sat on Mara's lap, gnawing on a wooden toy. Grace leaned against Jonah's side. Emma and Daniel sat on the porch steps, talking quietly. "Pa?" Daniel said eventually. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." "Do you ever regret it, choosing this life instead of the solitude you had before?" Jonah thought about that question, really thought about it. Did he miss the quiet, the simplicity, the freedom from responsibility? "No," he said finally, with absolute certainty. "Not even for a moment. This, all of you, this is everything I didn't know I needed, and I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world." "Not even on the hard days?" Emma asked. "When Sam won't sleep and Grace is cranky and we're all getting on each other's nerves?" Jonah laughed. "Not even then, because even the hard days are better with you all in them." "I love you, Pa," Grace said suddenly, her small voice clear in the evening air. Jonah's throat tightened. "I love you too, sweetheart. All of you. More than I can say." Mara looked at him over Sam's head, and he saw his own feelings reflected in her eyes, gratitude, wonder, deep and abiding love. They'd come so far, the two of them. From a bride call in a dusty town to this moment, this family, this life. From unwanted and alone to chosen and cherished. It hadn't been easy. Life on the frontier never was. But they'd faced every challenge together, and they'd built something extraordinary. Not just a homestead, but a home. Not just a household, but a family. As the stars began to emerge and the children's voices rose in laughter, Jonah pulled Mara close and kissed her temple. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" "For saying yes. For taking a chance on me. For building this life with me." "Thank you for choosing me," Mara said. "For seeing something in me that no one else did." "I saw everything," Jonah said. "I just didn't know it yet." They sat together as darkness fell, and the children eventually drifted toward bed, their voices growing quieter, their movements slower. And when the last child was tucked in and the cabin was finally quiet, Jonah and Mara stood together at the window, looking out at the land they'd claimed, the life they'd built. "We did it," Mara said softly. "We actually did it." "We did," Jonah agreed, his arm around her waist. "And we're going to keep doing it, every day, for the rest of our lives. Promise?" "Promise." And as they turned toward their own bed, toward another night of shared warmth and whispered conversations, Jonah knew with absolute certainty that the woman no one wanted had given him everything that mattered. She'd given him a family, a home, a purpose. A reason to believe that life was better shared than endured alone. And in return, he'd given her what she'd never had, the unshakable knowledge that she was wanted, chosen, treasured, and loved. Not because she'd earned it or proved herself worthy, but simply because she was. The cowboy who'd chosen the bride no one wanted had found that what she gave him changed everything, not just his frontier life, but his very soul, and that made all the difference in the world.